The top 5 dirty dog consoles. We're not talking the dirtiest, and we're not talking the doggiest. We're talking dirty dogs. So, what is a dirty dog? Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I stay up past my bedtime to eat banana pancakes each night and proudly call myself a dirty dog for it. But let's take a look at the dirty dog himself. The dog from Duck Hunt drives players nuts, but most people wouldn't really say it's bad game design or anything you would be genuinely that upset about, except for your cousin who smashed an NES zapper through the living room window. It's just something a little off the beaten path that needs to be called out. He's a dirty dog. It adds character and ultimately makes the game more lovable and memorable, which is why I say being a dirty dog is a badge of honor in the context of this video. And with that, at number 5, we have the Game Boy, the original Game Boy. This system was underpowered with a dirty dog of a screen if I've ever seen one, and yet lasted for years longer than anyone could have expected it to, except for the people who purchased the roughly 118 million units it ended up selling. And yeah, some of you might be thinking, wait a second, 118 million units includes sales of the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Color too. But remember, we're talking dirty dogs here, with the Color being especially debatable since it had exclusive games. But the Game Boy might just be one of the more notable examples of consoles adding new but similar hardware as part of the same line to extend the life cycle of the system, keeping things fresh. Not so easily done either. I've tried doing this for myself with a new hairdo. Didn't exactly get Game Boy Color-like results. It's not just the total number of years that the Game Boy line was able to stay relevant for, launching in 1989 with the Game Boy Advance not releasing until all the way in 2001. What's more significant is what was going on in the gaming world during that time. The NES was out when the Game Boy first launched, and the PlayStation 2 had already released by the end of it. The specs of the handheld, of which the Game Boy was the market leader, were well behind the home console side of things, but it stayed popular nonetheless, aided by one last shot in the arm of popularity from the Pokemon craze in the late 90s. And speaking of things that stick around for a while, I guess Pokemon is here to stay. Next up, at number 4, we have the Sega Dreamcast. People might hate Sega for what happened to the Dreamcast, but they typically don't hate the Dreamcast itself, they love it, showing up to the console party earlier than it was supposed to, just a few years after the Sega Saturn before it, but then also left earlier than it was supposed to. Who does that? Actually, I know someone who does. You want to talk about being done dirty? Talk to any Sega Dreamcast fan. With the Dreamcast storming into their lives, giving them an awesome video game console experience, and a mere 18 months after the console released in the US, announced that it would be discontinued. Imagine if you were eating something delicious and halfway through it was taken away. That can leave you feeling dark and empty. I mean, what the heck? Typically, a console is only supposed to go under if it sucks, but unfortunately, Sega was having financial issues. It was even company policy for a while to hoard extra ketchup packets when eating fast food. Not really, but hey, that's a dirty dog maneuver I can certainly endorse. The Dreamcast had a good reputation among fans, but it just didn't matter. And part of the reason it didn't matter is because guess what was on the horizon? That's right, coming in at number 3 on my list, dun dun dun, the PlayStation 2, making the list for essentially killing off Sega as a home console maker, or at the very least, making sure of it. And it did it not just as a game console, but famously as a DVD player as well. Sort of a dirty dog move in itself. I mean, how were people supposed to resist playing great games and watching great movies all from one device? The PS2's domination didn't stop at the Dreamcast and your older cousin's DVD player either. There was more butt whooping to be dealt out, smacking around both the GameCube and Xbox to the point that the sales numbers almost look like some sort of overstated joke just to prove a point. But no, the sales difference really was that drastic. So while you can't blame the PS2 for doing what it was supposed to do, sell really well, I'd still say any console that outsold its competition that brutally has to be considered a dirty dog. And no console did this to the extent that the PlayStation 2 did. Coming in at number 2 on my list would be the TurboGrafx 16, or the PC Engine, or the Turbo Duo, or the Core Graphics, or the Turbo CD, or the PC Engine Duo, or the OK, we get it. This console had a lot of different hardware with different names across different regions, and yet, even with so many names, there's still plenty of people who have never gotten familiar with even one of them. Being a very Japanese-centric console, it never really took off anywhere outside of Japan. As a result, it remains a bit of a niche console nowadays, however, very loved by those who do play it with lots of great games. Collecting for it is kind of a hassle for those who want to collect the US TurboGrafx 16 iteration of it, or are scared to collect the cheaper Japanese games for some reason, or are confused by all the different names, leading them to come up with a collecting solution of their own. Well, hey, that makes things pretty simple. But yeah, this console makes the list for being so convoluted when it comes to the hardware and games, mixing together a combination of games that came on cards, CD games, as well as games that required certain specialty cards to play certain CD games. Doesn't play DVDs though, I tried. You'll want to do at least a little bit of research before collecting for this console. You can't just jump in without knowing anything, unless you get the Mini. And for the number 1 console on my list, the dirtiest dog of them all, the Sega Saturn. Congratulations! A great console in its own right, with plenty of dirty doggery to go around. For starters, it had a surprise release back in the day in the US. Typically, surprises can be nice, but if it's in an unexpected way and you swing for the fences, it can go wrong. I introduced myself to the new neighbors with a bunch of bananas as a housewarming. Would you believe we're not friends? Not only that, but the Sega Saturn can be kind of a conundrum for people to this day. Many, not all, but many of its best games have prices meaner than a junkyard dog. Really expensive to collect physical copies of nowadays, not to mention many have never been re-released or are difficult to try to emulate, although some people will tell you that's gotten better over time. In any case, as much as fans of the system rant and rave about how great its games are, for those who are curious, it might just feel like there's too much of a barrier to entry. So it's kind of just a big tease for many, like the idea of having free time. But there we have it. That's my top 5. I'd ask you whether or not you agree with it, but considering it's all based on very arbitrary criteria that was made up by me, you sort of can't. Really, this was just an excuse to talk about video games, something I tend to do. Regardless, you may have some dirty dog consoles of your own you'd like to throw a bone to, of which I'd love to hear. So with that, feel free to share your thoughts, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the Retro Bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the Retro